Okay, so welcome everybody. This is our regular Monday afternoon class on topics in Hasidic psychology. And this week the title is intriguing. Obviously it has to do with Purim. It's the missing step in 12 steps. So I think almost everybody is familiar with 12 steps, which is the famous addiction program that was developed in the 1930s in the United States. A lot of people don't know that 12 steps was actually the latest incarnation of something much older. The first person to really study these types of, as he called them, conversions, spiritual religious conversions, was William James. And actually I was looking this morning for my copy of The Varieties of Religious Experience and I couldn't find it. So I can't read from it, but I can tell you that there are 2 chapters there. It was such an important thing in James's study of the psychology of religion that he dedicated 2 whole chapters to it. It's called Conversion, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And we'll come across this a little bit, tiny bit later, as we look at some of the things that 12 Steps had in its original form, in its interaction with a very famous psychologist, Carl Jung. So the reason we're bringing this up this week is because of Purim, and we know that a lot of people struggle with various addictions in life. This has become more and more of a struggle as the 20th century went on, and certainly now in our century, the 21st. And it's very hard to find anything as successful as 12 steps. Now, if you know anything about Rabbi Ginzburg's understanding of this topic, then you know that he's adamantly against 12 steps, which comes as a surprise to a lot of people because there's really not that much else to offer, as it were. And it's not very nice to tell somebody, look, this thing that's helping you is really not the best option, and you should be looking for something else. It's especially not so nice to say this when I really don't think I have a different alternative to offer. So that makes it very difficult. So I'm not going to talk about 12 steps in the sense of why not, even though it's going to be hard not to mention it at some point, because as you'll see from an exchange of letters between Bill, the person who founded 12 Steps, AA, and Jung, there are very clear things that are said in that letter that are not usually told to people who participate in an AA program or any other kind of 12-step program. But as I said, this is not the major point that I want to talk about. I want to talk about something a little bit different. Whenever you come and you tell a Jew there's 12 steps, so obviously if there's 12 is good, then 13 must be even better, right? So it's very clear why 12 steps, which is a Christian shita, it's a Christian, it's based on Christianity, wouldn't like 13, as we know that there's no 13th floor in the United States, and they have this general problem with the 13th member of anything. But in Yiddishkeit, we love 13. And the reason we love 13 is because we have the 13 principles of divine mercy, which are the first and most important source of God's compassion for man, and the first and most important source for how to describe God. He's a God who's compassionate and kind and so on. But 13 also becomes the basis for all of the oral tradition. There are 13 principles upon which Rabbi Yishmael taught how to study the Torah in order to develop the oral part, in order to see how the oral part comes out of the written part. And when we come to the inner teachings of the Torah, we have the 13 sfirot. It's very strange. Usually we talk about 10 sfirot. But really in Chassidus we talk about 13 because the crown divides into 3, and then there's also knowledge, da'at. So altogether we have 13. And certainly when it comes to Jewish faith, we have the 13 principles from Maimonides, 13 principles of faith. There's been a lot of debate upon whether Judaism even holds by such things to define what faith is. Certainly in our generation, don't catch anybody by what they believe in or what they don't believe in. The Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe said many times that matters of faith shouldn't be set in stone. That there's certainly things to be said in many different directions, some of which seem at first to even be contrary and opposite to what a Jew should believe. But the truth is that since God is incomprehensible and undescribable, there is a lot of room for a lot of different interpretations in terms of faith. So the number 13 is a lovely number, and when we're in about a month, we're going to sit down to the Seder, and a lot of us are going to sing Echad Mi Yodea, one who knows one. So first of all, the most important number in Judaism is obviously 1 because God is 1, but the value of 1 is also 13. Echad is, Aleph is 1, Chet is 8, and Dalet is 4. Together that's 13. And the song ends with who knows 13. 13 is the apex, it's the epitome. It's the pinnacle of what we sing in the song of recognizing the value of different numbers. So, like I said, if 12 is good, 13 is even better. But we're going to have to see where this 13 comes from. What is it really doing? What is the 13 going to do? Not long ago, we lost the presence of a tremendous sage and psychologist and holy individual, Rabbi Twersky. And he was famous for making 12 steps something that was very acceptable in the Jewish world. And as I was reading something that he wrote a long time ago, 1993, it's 28 years ago, he wrote about the different reasons why somebody would be reluctant to accept 12 steps as a program for getting out of addictions. And I want to read from it. We're going to read a few things today to get into this topic. And he says that the objections are really along 3 lines. And the first one is the one that really, he doesn't say whether he's troubled by this or not, but he brings this as the first and primary objection. And he says, AA's insistence on total abstinence. Never touch alcohol again. And in essence, this would be true to any type of addiction. At the moment that you touch it, you're doomed. You were doomed to go back to where you were. This is a very strong objection because as Jews, with Purim coming up especially, we know that there is literally a mitzvah to drink alcohol on Purim. In a month and a few days, we're going to sit down to the Seder, and there's another mitzvah to drink 4 cups of wine. And this creates tremendous anxiety for anybody who's been able to break their addiction through AA, because they've been taught that the moment that you give in, you will regress. You will go back to where you were. Now, it's a very delicate and sensitive topic. So I'm not going to say anything about what one should do. Rather, I'm going to look at a certain aspect of Purim that is very surprising in the beginning and has to do with why we drink on Purim. And from that, I think we'll learn something about how to handle, maybe not addiction, but certainly how to handle cravings, how to handle things that are even cravings that have gone out of hand. They've gotten out of hand and the person feels that he doesn't control them anymore. To share something from my own life, in the past year, I've been on I changed my diet completely. I had to change it because of health reasons. And nothing serious, thank God, but very annoying. And I went through this process of withdrawal. In my case, it was from cravings of eating. I went through a process of withdrawal from eating processed food, meaning today I don't eat anything that you can buy in a store, basically. I only eat things that we prepare at home. And in the beginning, it was very, very difficult. But the thing that really clicked for me at some point and changed the whole way I was looking at it was that I suddenly realized that for me, it's always been easy to walk by a McDonald's and not be tempted. Not because it's fast food or junk food, but because it's simply not kosher. And it's so ingrained in my mind that I can sit next to somebody eating the most gourmet meal in the world, and I don't even feel tempted in any way. I mean, I can smell that it smells good, but I understand that it's probably good, but I never felt tempted in any way. And it suddenly clicked for me the moment that I understood that from now on, the foods that don't agree with me are just not kosher, as it were. They're under the same category. For me personally, it's not for anybody else. The moment that that switched in my mind, it became almost trivial to abstain. I can sit with everybody on Shabbos and they're having whatever they're having, the foods I used to love, and somehow it doesn't even register. It doesn't really do anything. It's like I'm looking at it and it's very nice that they're eating it and it looks great, but it just doesn't do anything. And that was a very interesting switch that happened in my mind, and I think that it is going to tie in very strongly with what we're going to see today. Okay. So I mentioned this objection about insistence on total abstinence, and the question of how do you still enjoy, or how do you still use alcohol in the religious setting when it becomes a mitzvah? So to get into this topic, we're going to start by looking at the Megillah, at the scroll of Esther. And to do that, I'm going to have to share my screen, which is always a challenge. So let me see if I can do this right. Just one moment. Almost there. Okay, and now I'll share the screen. Hopefully, get this right. Here we go. Okay. So if I got it right, we're all looking at the first few verses of the scroll of Esther. And we all know this. We read it every year, twice a year, so it's pretty well known. So I'll just read the English. It happened in the days of Achashverosh, that Achashverosh, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Achashverosh occupied the royal throne in the fortress Shushan, in the city of Shushan. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet. Now, the word here for banquet is not exactly, well, we need to know the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is mishteh. It's the word that you see here. So a banquet is really mishteh. And mishteh in Hebrew comes from the word to drink. Specifically, it means to drink wine. He gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers, the administration of Persia and Media, the nobles and the governors of the provinces in his service. For no fewer than 180 days, he displayed the vast riches of his kingdom and the splendid glory of his majesty. Now, every year we start with this, but I don't think everybody knows what the significance of these first words really is. The whole story of the Megillah begins with a wine banquet. That's the starting point. The amazing thing is that we were quickly thrown into this whole plot to destroy the whole Jewish people. And the question then becomes, why in the world did we start from Achashverosh's wine banquet? What significance could that possibly have for what happened later? And even if you would say that it has something to do with the fact that Vashti was taken off her throne and Esther was chosen in her place, still the context is not so important. Why do we need to know that this is a wine banquet? And the whole first chapter of the Megillah just describes the banquet itself and the splendors in it, and especially the fact that everybody was given as much as they wanted to drink. Vashtiya kadat einones. The wine was as anybody wanted, with no limits. The surprising answer that the sages give, it's very surprising, in fact, not well known, I think. Let's read it. The students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, for what reason were they enemies of the Jewish people? Enemies of the Jewish people is a euphemism for the Jewish people. That's the way that the Talmud says, when it's going to say something negative about Jews, it doesn't say it about the Jews. It says like enemies of the Jewish people. Really, it means the Jewish people. So for what reason were the Jewish people in that generation deserving of annihilation? Why did it come to that? What happened? Rabbi Shimon said to them, say the answer to the question yourselves. If you know the question, you probably already know the answer. What they were looking for was some validation of the answer they already knew. This is a very important point that we'll get into later. They said to him, the students answered their own question. And they said, it is because they partook of the feast of that wicked one. The feast here is again the word mishteh, sudato, the feast, the banquet of that wicked one, talking about Achashverosh. Very interesting. So what they're saying is that it all begins with the banquet because that was the sin of the generation, taking part in that banquet. What's wrong with taking part in that banquet? Well, there's a lot of things that could be wrong. It could be that the wine wasn't kosher, it could be the food wasn't kosher. But it's deeper than that. It becomes deeper and a lot more telling when we notice how the Megillah ends. And this is the amazing thing. Let's turn to it. In chapter 9, the rest of the Jews, those in the king's provinces, likewise mustered and fought for their lives. They disposed of their enemies. Again, they got into this according to Rabbi Shimon and his students, because they took part in the banquet. They disposed of their enemies, killing 75,000 of their foes, but they did not lay hands on the spoil. That was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and they rested on the 14th day and made it a day of feasting and merrymaking. So it's not just that feasting, it's not just Seudah in this case. It says, look in the Hebrew, Ve'asoto yom mishteh v'simcha, to make it into a banquet. What's going on here? The whole problem started with going to a banquet. It ends by making the day of the victory a banquet. But we know that it's much more than that. It's not just that on that day when they made their banquet, it didn't end then, but rather what happened? Mordechai recorded these events, and he sent dispatches to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Achashverosh, near and far, charging them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year. That's the same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month which has been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking. Meaning, this is where we get the mitzvah, one of the four mitzvahs, one of the four commandments of Purim, to have a banquet. Now, right away, one begins to wonder. The problem started with their wanting to take part and taking part in King Achashverosh's banquet. The result was that it became a mitzvah, it became a commandment from the sages to every year celebrate a banquet in commemoration of Purim, in commemoration of the victory, but not just the victory, but of everything that happened. That's why we read the Megillah. So we have four mitzvos, four commandments to read the Megillah, to have a banquet, to give to the poor, and to send food to one another for the other person's banquet. And by the way, three of the mitzvot, giving to the poor and the banquet and sending food to another, are all related to the banquet. They're all related to the idea of making a wine banquet. It becomes something essential. What is this? This is the amazing principle that is the highest form of medicine, called curing like with like. If the problem started by the Jews wanting to partake in something they shouldn't, they have a craving for something that they shouldn't, apparently. The way to fight that craving is not by making it prohibitive. It's not by prohibiting the craving. It's not by trying to extract it. But rather, the wisdom of the Torah, the wisdom of the sages says that the way that you extract the craving is by making it into a commandment. Now, we can say this a little jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, that the moment that you make something into a commandment and you have to do it, it takes all the fun out, right? So going to a banquet and having fun at a party, that's one thing. But having to do that, and it becomes a whole big operation that you have to do every year, that takes all the fun out. And the moment that you took all the fun out, obviously the person's not going to have as much of a craving for it. So that's the tongue-in-cheek approach to this all. And it says, really, the moment you make something required, it's no longer something that somebody will do on their own. And they're sort of stuck with it. And it becomes a big mess. And it becomes something that you're obligated to do, and it's no longer as fun. But that's just the external part of it. But it's true. It is true. At the moment that you force somebody, like for instance, if a child is having trouble with the internet, they're watching too much, they're using a cell phone too much, whatever it is, instead of prohibiting it, instead of trying to limit it, enforce it in the sense of force the person to have to spend a certain amount of time every day doing certain things with that phone. You'll see that slowly you develop a different relationship with it. You become detoxicated. It's not as toxic as it was before. This is called curing like with like, and it's called the highest form of medicine. Our medicine is usually allopathic. Allopathic means that we cure like with the opposites. We go according to what the mind says. The mind says that if there's something hurting you, you have to extract it. You have to take it away. You have to poison it. You have to kill it. Homeopathic medicine, and I'm not necessarily talking here about homeopathy with a capital H, but homeopathy with a lowercase h, which builds on the like cures like principle, is really based on Torah. It's really based on the notion that when God comes to cure something, he does so with like, with the same thing. This principle was stated in the Talmud, for instance. The greatest physician in the Talmud is a sage by the name of Shmuel, and he says the very simple thing, that if a person has a fever, how do you get rid of the fever? You drink something hot. Why? Because the heat in the hot drink is what gets rid of the fever inside the person. So the hot cures its likeness. It cures the heat. So too, the sages use this principle. Mordechai and Esther use this principle to say that if the problem began with a craving for wine in this banquet, the way to really cure it is by making it an obligation to have a wine banquet every year to commemorate what happened. And that itself is the like that cures like, that cures the craving for the wine. Now, this principle, again, it works in many different ways, and it also works psychologically. To get into the psychological aspect of this, I want to read an exchange of letters between Bill, I don't remember his last name, probably some people here know what it is, the man who's responsible for creating AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the psychoanalyst Carl Jung. So let me bring this up. This is a tremendously revealing pair of letters between them. And we'll see the same principle of like cures like in their correspondence. So let me share the screen again. I think I need to find the window first, the one I want. Just a moment. I see it here, but I can't find it on my sharing tool. Oh, here it is. Here it is. Okay. So let's see what he has to say. One of the projects that Bill had planned for his retirement, I'm reading down here on the bottom third of the page. was to deal with an unfinished task, acknowledging AA's indebtedness to the countless people he felt were responsible for its creation. At the top of his list was Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst who had appointed Roland H. Roland H. was one of the first people to undergo conversion, as we'll see, and to discover the spiritual power of conversion, and was able to break his dependence on alcohol with that. And subsequently, Bill himself via Ebby in a spiritual direction. Bill's letter to Jung, dated January 23rd, 1961, is among the most eloquent of the thousands of letters he wrote in his lifetime. After first introducing himself, Bill wrote, "I doubt if you are aware that a certain conversation you once had with one of your patients, a Mr. Roland H., back in the early 1930s, did play a critical role in the founding of our fellowship. Our remembrance of Roland H.'s statements about his experience with you is as follows. Having exhausted other means of recovery from his alcoholism, it was about 1931 that he became your patient," meaning that Roland became Jung's patient as going to a psychologist. "I believe he remained under your care for perhaps a year. His admiration for you was boundless, and he left you with a feeling of much confidence. He felt that the therapy had worked. To his great consternation, he soon relapsed into intoxication. Certain that you were his court of last resort, he again returned to your care, then followed the conversation between you that was to become the first link in the chain of events that led to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous." So there's some more here that's skipped. First of all, you frankly told him of his hopelessness. That's a very common theme in 12 steps, that you are hopeless. So far as any further medical or psychiatric treatment might be concerned, there's nothing that the medical establishment, be it psychological health or mental health or physical health, has to offer. This candid and humble statement of yours, because it was Jung admitting that he had nothing to offer, was beyond doubt the first foundation stone upon which our society has since been built. And it's true that there's nothing to give you. You're hopeless. Coming from you, one he so trusted and admired, the impact upon him was immense. When he then asked you if there was any other hope, not coming from the medical community, you told him that there might be, provided he could become the subject of a spiritual or religious experience. In short, a genuine conversion. You pointed out how such an experience, if brought about, might remotivate him when nothing else could. But you did caution, though, that while such experiences had sometimes brought recovery to alcoholics, they were nevertheless comparatively rare. You recommended that he place himself in a religious atmosphere and hope for the best. This, I believe, was the substance of your advice. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Roland H. joined the Oxford Group, an evangelical movement then at the height of its success in Europe, and one with which you are doubtless familiar. You will remember their large emphasis upon the principles of self-survey, confession, restitution, and the giving of oneself in service to others. These, by the way, are covered beautifully by William James in his 2 chapters on conversion and the varieties of religious experience. They strongly stressed meditation and prayer. In these surroundings, Roland H. did find a conversion experience. It's exactly what it's called, a conversion, that released him for the time being from his compulsion to drink. Very long in its entirety, the letter went on to tell Jung how the message reached Bill at the low point of his own alcoholism, and so on. As Bill put it, I'm skipping a little, the concept proved to be the foundation of such success as Alcoholics Anonymous has since achieved. This has made conversion experience available on an almost wholesale basis. The closing of the letter was Bill at his most gracious. As you will now clearly see, this astonishing chain of events actually started long ago in your consulting room, and it was directly founded upon your own humility and deep perception. Very many thoughtful AAs are students of your writings because of your conviction that man is something more than intellect, emotion, and $2 worth of chemicals. You have especially endeared yourself to us. Please be certain that your place in the affection and in the history of our fellowship is like no others. Gratefully yours. So this is very telling because Bill here is revealing, he's saying something I think is obvious really when you read the story of his life, but that the way to get out of addiction is through conversion. Conversion, we understand, is a religious experience. What's lacking? Before we get into Jung's response, I want to talk about the 13th step. The 13th step is really the way the Jews understand religion. The religion without action, religion that doesn't contain mitzvot, it doesn't contain commandments, is not religion. It's spirituality, but it's not a connection with God. In Judaism, a connection with God boils down in the end to action. If God would have come down and revealed himself at Mount Sinai and had nothing more to tell us than what the secrets of the universe are, Judaism would probably not be around today. There were many people to whom God revealed himself and revealed some secrets of the universe. Job was one of them. At the end of the book of Job, God gives him 50 different revelations about reality. He phrases them in the form of questions. Jethro had a revelation. A lot of people had revelations. What sets Torah apart is 613 commandments. When I share with you what I want from you, that's a different level of connection. If I only tell you what the universe is about, I increase your knowledge, your appreciation. Those are all very important things. But that doesn't create a bond between us. To create a bond between God and man, God shares his will, what I want from you. We share our will with God every day, not to be, can't remain unbalanced here. So 3 times a day we tell God what we want from him. But that's what makes the connection so strong. It's the same way with marriage. Imagine the 2 people were connected only in terms of their thoughts. I have to say that when I was a lot younger and I had just gotten married, after a few months, my wife told me, "You don't love me." And I said, "How can you say that? I love you dearly." And she said, "I know that you don't love me. How do I know that you don't love me? Because you never do anything for me." My wife is not somebody who would say that without a lot of thought behind it. And so I got to thinking about what that meant. And I think I came out with a completely different understanding of what the deepest relationship with people means. The deepest relationship is when I can do something for you. When I'm needed by you and I feel that I need you. Need is, in this end, the source of so much meaning in relationships. I need you. Think about this. Here is a nation of slaves whose life meant nothing just a few weeks ago. They come out of Egypt, where again, they could be used as fodder. They could be used as anything. They were worthless. And suddenly they have this great revelation of godliness. But it doesn't end with a revelation. It ends with something so much deeper, with God telling them, I need you. Every single last one of you. And you know what? You're all equally necessary. You're all equally important. And not just important because you can lift a hoe or you can lay bricks. You're important to the master of the universe, the creator, because you'll do mitzvot, because you'll do commandments. This is mind-boggling. When you think about what period in history this was said, it's the most emancipating prospect. That here I am, a person who lives and dies, who has a limited lifespan, limited abilities, and the infinite comes to me and says, I need you. What a tremendous feeling of meaning in life that gives. So Judaism is founded on the notion of commandments, because commandments create a bond. And so the sages build upon the same thing, and they say, if you really want to make an impact, if you really want to have a religious experience, it's not just something spiritual. It has to be something active, some action that you take. If you want to be able to fix a craving, to cure a craving, and we'll see in a moment what we mean by cure in the deepest sense, it means that we need to couch that craving in some action. And that's what the sages did with the commandment to have a wine banquet on Purim. It's a commandment. It's not just a good piece of advice. It's not just a nice to have. And it's not, like I said before, just to make you feel obligated so that you don't enjoy it as much. Those things are also true. But the deep meaning is that the 13th step is always that there has to be a commandment involved. The commandment is what gives meaning. The commandment is what in the end motivates. As opposed to the way that sometimes we think that commandments make me sick and tired. It's only when I don't think about what the meaning of the commandment is. The meaning of the commandment is that the infinite has come down to forge a bond with me. There has to be what we call over la'asiyata, a transition into action. There has to be action. It's not just in the mind. There has to be something proactive, but not just as good advice, but as a requirement, as a necessity, something that becomes unbreakable, something that becomes a part of life. That is the 13th step that's missing. Now, I want to explain something a little bit deeper by looking at Jung's response. So turning back to, I think we're still sharing the screen, right? Yes. Jung's reply, datelined Kusnacht, Zurich, January 30th, 1961. Read in its entirety. Dear Mr. Wilson, your letter has been very welcome. Indeed, I had no news from Roland H. anymore and often wondered what had been his fate. Our conversation, which he has adequately reported to you, had an aspect of which he did not know. Now Jung is going to tell Bill, I think it's Bill Wilson, right? So he's going to tell Bill where he got his idea from, why he thought that the real answer to curing an addiction like alcohol would be a religious conversion, something that he didn't share with Roland. The reason that I could not tell him everything was that those days I had to be exceedingly careful what I said. I found out that I was misunderstood in every possible way. Thus, I was very careful when I talked to Roland H. But what I really thought about was the result of many experiences with men of his kind. His craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of a spiritual thirst over a being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language as unia deika, or union with God, becoming one with God. And we just talked about what it means to become one with God. The real bond with God comes through performance of commandments. That is where the bond is really forged. So the conversion is all very well and nice. The conversion can give motivation. But the question is, motivation for what? For the bond to be one, for a person to become one with God, it requires a commandment. So let's see exactly why Jung thought this. Why does he think that a craving for alcohol is in the end a craving for God? And not just for God in the sense, in the philosophical sense, but like he terms it here, in the mystical sense, as a union with God. How could one formulate such an insight in a language that is not misunderstood in our days? Think about, we're already in the 2020s. Everything is spiritual today. Everybody talks about God. Everybody talks about spirituality. Here we're talking about the 1960s. The rational is ruling everything. There's no room for any spirituality. The only right and legitimate way to express to such an experience is that it happens to you in reality. And it can only happen to you when you walk on a path which leads you to higher understanding. And again, for Jung, it's understanding. In Judaism, it means understanding that leads to action. Lilmod al menat la'asot, to learn in order to do. You might be led to that goal by an act of grace, meaning something will shine up on you from above, or through a personal and honest contact with friends, or through a higher education of the mind beyond the confines of mere rationalism. I see from your letter that Roland H. has chosen the second way, which was, under the circumstances, obviously the best one. I am strongly convinced that the evil principle prevailing in this world leads the unrecognized spiritual need into perdition if it is not counteracted either by a real religious insight or by the protective wall of human community. An ordinary man not protected by an action from above, an isolating society, cannot resist the power of evil, which is called very aptly the devil. But the use of such words arouses so many mistakes that one can only keep aloof from them as much as possible. I'll translate this into AA terms. It means never be alone. The biggest principle of Torah. You always have to have a friend. You always have to have somebody that you can turn to and talk to. These are the reasons why I could not give a full and sufficient explanation to Roland H., but I'm risking it with you because I conclude from a very decent and honest letter that you have acquired a point of view about the misleading platitudes one usually hears about alcoholism. And now Jung gives his analysis of like cures like. Alcohol in Latin is spiritus. How do you say alcohol in America or Canada? It's a store. It's not just a liquor store. It's called Wines and Spirits. Spiritus. Is that by mistake? Jung doesn't think so. Jung was a master at using language to analyze essence, to uncover essence. And he used the same word for the highest religious experience, as well as for the most depraving poison. Alcohol is spirit, and spirituality is spirit. Like cures like. If spirit in its, as he calls it, depraved or poisonous form causes you to become an alcoholic, then spirit in its pristine form, in its higher form, will cure the same issue that you have, the same craving. But again, like I said, you need the 13th step. The 13th step is to transfer, is to transform, is to take everything that you've learned, everything that you've understood now, and had in your religious conversion, in your experience, and transform it into some commandment. The commandment makes you the master of the bond you have with God. It puts it in your hands. It is now up to you. That's the thing that is so missing from 12 steps. Because though 12 steps may empower you to think differently, it lacks the most important part that Judaism has to offer, which is to empower you to act differently, to lead a different life. And the way that you empower somebody to act a different life, to act differently, is through mitzvot, through commandments. And so, indeed, when somebody would come to the Arizal, to Rabbi Isaac Luria, and he would tell him, I have a certain issue, psychological, physical, whatever it is. When anybody came to any of the Hasidic masters, the advice was always not just some kind of spiritual understanding, which is important in its own right, but the advice always contained practice. There was some mitzvah that you needed to do better. There was some minhag, some tradition that you didn't know of that you should practice, that you should be extra careful about. It could be, for instance, I'll give an example. A person who has problems with his right hand, his right arm, whatever it is, somebody could come up with the conclusion that since the right arm is the arm of loving kindness, it's where the sphere of loving kindness is. So perhaps he's not giving enough charity. That's his problem. His problem is with charity. But when you say that like cures like, the answer is that it's not just that he has a problem with charity. It's not just changing his point of view on it. It's actually increasing the charity. What do we mean? That he has to begin to see that his purpose in life has to do with charity. The place where I'm hit, exactly here, like in spirit, the place where I'm hurt is the place where my calling is. If my calling was to achieve union with God, and that's what spirit means, if I don't attain that, I fall into the negative side of that same craving. Every craving can go through a transformation into something positive. That's the staple. That's, one would say, the unique promise of Judaism. That's the unique promise of Torah. Let's look at the beginning of the Torah. What was the first sin? That Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge. Is the Torah's answer to forbid and prohibit knowledge? On the contrary, it becomes that knowledge is the most highest of goals. We say, sorry, I'm saying it in Hebrew. You have shown that knowledge of God is the goal, to know God. Is knowledge foreign to Judaism? On the contrary, the biggest mitzvah is to learn Torah, to increase knowledge. True, says Solomon, Yosif dat, Yosif machov, the man who increases knowledge increases his pain. But so many sages after that said, and so what? As long as he increases knowledge, because we don't cure the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge by abstaining from knowledge. We cure it by seeking knowledge of God, by seeking knowledge of Torah. The same is true with alcohol. The same is true with a sexual addiction. The same is true with all of them. There's something great that you can achieve with this, but it has to go through the commandments. It has to go through the way that God gives you to function and act in the world in a way that these actions are actually the union with God himself. So again, I started with saying this is a sensitive subject, and if anybody's a recovering alcoholic, I don't know what to say, but certainly if you're struggling with alcohol, even if you're not an alcoholic, struggling with any kind of craving, I believe that the answer is not just to have a spiritual awakening, but more importantly, to find the mitzvah that takes that craving and puts it into the context of serving God. And the moment that you turn it into that context, the moment that you put it into that context and you act upon it, that is the true transformation, the true sublimation of the craving, and turns it into something positive in your life, and can actually help you uncover what it is in that craving that connects to your life's mission. So that was the 13th step that I believe is missing from the 12 steps.